one of the most atmospheric entries in the Metroid series. Over the years, Fusion has developed a strong cult following thanks to its tight gameplay, horror-like tension, and narrative focus on Samus trapped aboard a parasite-infested space station. Fan expectations for a remake are extremely high because Fusion is already considered near perfect in structure, so any update would need to modernize it without losing its identity. Most fans imagine the remake using a modern engine similar to Metroid Dread, with fluid animations, fast combat, and cinematic presentation while preserving the original's claustrophobic, mission-based progression. A major expectation is expanded exploration. The original Fusion was more linear than other Metroid titles, so fans hope a remake would open up optional routes, secret areas, and deeper backtracking opportunities while keeping the restricted station feeling. Another big demand is improved AI for enemies like the X-Parasite variants and SA-X encounters, making them more unpredictable and terrifying rather than scripted. Visually, fans expect a darker, more oppressive tone. Flickering emergency lights, shifting corridors, and stronger body horror elements emphasizing mutation and infection. Sound design is also critical, with many hoping for heavier ambient tension and dynamic music that reacts to danger. Narratively, expectations include expanded lore about the Federation's experiments and Samus's psychological state, possibly adding new cutscenes or logs without changing the original story. However, fans are cautious. Too many changes could ruin what made Fusion iconic. Ultimately, the demand for a remake reflects both nostalgia and curiosity. Players want modern graphics and smoother gameplay, but they also fear losing the tightly controlled fear and isolation that made Fusion legendary in the first place.
Gameplay-wise, well, of course Nintendo would probably avoid changing too much. The exploration structure remains one of the greatest ever designed, unlocking abilities, revisiting the areas, slowly understanding the map. That formula still works perfectly today. What fans really want is just smoother movements, refined controls, improved combat feel, and quality of life updates to modernize its experience without simplifying it. With those things considered, a remake has to preserve that, not just the map, not just the bosses, but the feeling. That sense of being completely alone in a place that used to be alive. And now imagine that feeling rebuilt with modern technology. Dynamic lighting that shifts as you move through caverns, environmental effects that react to your presence, creatures that behave like less obstacle and more like part of an ecosystem. The kind of detail that doesn't interrupt the experience but deepens it, makes Zeebs feel less like a level and more like a world. That's sort of the opportunity here, not to modernize Super Metroid into something louder, but to make its quiet moments hit harder. Now, one of the biggest questions surrounding a remake right now like this is perspective, which is, for example, do you keep the classic two-dimensional side-scrolling structure, or do you expand it into something more three-dimensional? And based on how Nintendo has handled the series recently, especially with Metroid Dread, there's a pretty strong case for sticking to 2.5D. In fact, that approach keeps the core identity intact while allowing for modern animation, shooter controls, and more dynamic encounters to be added as well. But even within the structure, there is room to evolve. Movement could feel faster, more fluid, more responsive. Like Samus wouldn't just be navigating anymore, she's gonna be flowing through the environment. Wall jumps, shine sparks, morph ball transitions, all of it feeling seamless. Not mechanical, but natural. The kind of movement system that rewards mastery without overwhelming new players. And then, there's also the combat. Super Metroid wasn't about complex combat systems, it didn't need to be. It was about the tension, about managing space, timing, resources. A remake could build on that by making enemies more reactive, smarter, less predictable. Boss fights especially could become more dynamic with multiple phases, environmental interactions, and a stronger sense of scale. Because, let's be honest, fighting Kraid or Riley with modern design and technology, that's not just nostalgia, that's an event. But none of this works if the game loses its pacing. And pacing is almost everything in Super Metroid. The slow build, the moments where nothing happens, but everything feels like it could. The way the soundtrack fades in and out, reinforcing that sense of isolation. A remake has to respect that rhythm. It can't rush the player, it can't overload the experience with constant action. It has to let the world breathe. And that's when Nintendo's design philosophy becomes crucial, because they understand restraint. They understand that sometimes the best thing a game can do is step back and let the player feel something without forcing it. There's also the question of narrative. The original game told its story with minimal dialogue, relying on environmental storytelling and player interception. A remake, we think, could expand on that slightly as well, maybe through subtle cutscenes and additional context, but it also has to be careful, like over-explaining Super Metroid would take away from what made it special in the first place. The story works because it feels discovered, not delivered, and Samus herself is part of that. She's not a character who talks, she's a presence, a force moving through a world that reacts to her. That shouldn't really change. But what could evolve is how the game presents her actions, more expressive animations maybe, small details in how she moves, how she reacts to environments, how the world responds to her presence. These are the kind of upgrades that add depth without breaking immersion. In fact, there's also the map design. See, Zeebs is iconic, but it's also a product of its time. A remake has the chance to refine it, not to redesign it completely, but to enhance connectivity, improve flow, maybe introduce new areas that feel like they are always been there, hidden paths that weren't possible before, secrets that reward exploration, maybe some new ways, because exploration's the core of Super Metroid. Not just finding where to go next, but choosing to go somewhere unexpected and being rewarded for it. That sense of discovery is what defines the experience, and that's something modern games sometimes struggle to replace actually. Now imagine that feeling amplified. More layers, more depth, more reasons to get lost, and then find your way again. Technically, this remake could also be a showcase. Not in a flashy over-the-top way, but in a refined, polished way. Smooth performance, clean visuals, audio design that pulls you in instead of pushing at you. The kind of presentation that feels effortless, even though it's anything but. Because that's what a game like this really deserves. Respect. Not just a product, but as a piece of gaming history. However, we all know there's always a risk with remakes. The risk of over-polishing, per se, of something out the rough edges that gave the original its character. Super Metroid wasn't perfect, but its imperfections were part of its identity. The slight awkwardness and movement at times, the lack of direction, the moments where you genuinely didn't know what to do next, those were flaws, they were part of the experience. A remake has to understand that, it has to modernize without sterilizing. We've seen other games make that mistake when remade. Enhance without replacing, because it loses its balance. It stops being Super Metroid if done so. It will become something else, and maybe that's the real challenge here. Not building a better version of the game, but building a version that understands why it works in the first place. Because Super Metroid isn't just a classic, it's a feeling, a sense of isolation, of discovery. A quiet tension that builds and releases in ways most games don't even attempt. And if this remake captures that, if it respects that, then it won't just be a return, it'll be a reminder of how powerful simplicity can be.